amazed at the turnout, I have to say, at USC. If we had a talk at 4:30, there would be no one there because we would all have been on the freeway for at least an hour heading home. So thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I invited myself, but thank you for agreeing to my self-invitation. I'm just visiting New Orleans for a few days and reached out to Carrie, who's a wonderful old friend. So I'm going to talk to you about what Americans want schools to be teaching about potentially contentious topics and present evidence from 3 national surveys that I've directed. This work has been generously supported by the National Science Foundation. One of those grants, the one in the middle, was on Ted Cruz's list of woke grants. Although if I have to tell you, there's nothing particularly woke about it, but you could go and read the abstract for yourself if you're concerned about it. And also from the Hewlett Foundation, which is really the main funder of our survey work around these issues about what Americans want public schools to be teaching. So I'm going to talk to you about the curriculum context in the United States. I don't think I probably need to talk to you about that really because we're all aware of what's happening. I mean, just Friday there was a new Dear Colleague letter from the U.S. Department of Education coming down on, I think, K-12 and higher ed institutions for really doing anything related to race in schools. And so clearly this is a very of-the-moment topic. I'm going to tell you about the UAS, the Understanding America study, which is a source of data, and it's a great data source for you if you have any quantitative interests. It's a wonderful data source that anyone can access. And then I'm going to present results from 3 different studies. So the first study, there's the Civics education study, which is you are the first people on planet Earth to be seeing these results. The report is going to come out probably this week, but maybe next week. Not that I think anyone's going to be sharing the results, but I might ask you not to post the video until after that report goes up. And then I'll present results from 2 past reports on LGBT and race-related topics in the curriculum. So it goes without saying that this issue of the state control of curriculum is, as current as it gets. At the same time as we have red states, including Louisiana, enacting various restrictions on what can go on in the classroom. We have blue states like California doing the opposite, mandating the inclusion of topics related to LGBT identity. So we had the Fair, Inclusive, and Respectful Education Act in California over a decade ago now, although I have to say it has not particularly been implemented. But that was a mandate to include LGBT-related issues in all aspects of the curriculum, including social studies and health and other content areas. Although even within a blue state, we've had controversies around that, right? With red school districts in more conservative areas rebelling against the state mandate to include those topics. So we have a sort of an increasingly polarized education policy system in the United States where you have red state education policies and blue state education policies, and nowhere is that more fraught than around curriculum. At the same time, we have this sort of parents' rights movement that has been growing since at least 2021, was seen to play a role in the election of Governor Glenn Youngkin. Clearly, this is still a part of the playbook right now on the right in terms of framing parents' rights in education as an important issue, and I think in particular around curriculums, right? So parents' rights to restrict the curriculum that their child might be exposed to, there's clearly in the aftermath of the election and with what's been going on in the 5 or 6 weeks since Trump has been inaugurated, this remains an important issue, and I think clearly will be for at least the first portion of his term. But we don't really know all that much about what Americans actually think about these issues and the inclusion of these kinds of topics in the curriculum. So, with regard to LGBT issues, for instance, a Gallup poll finds that 52% of Americans believe that laws should require people to use public restrooms corresponding to their birth gender. And 62% of Americans believe that athletes should only be allowed to play on sports teams that match their birth gender. We have surveys around racial topics too. So for instance, a national survey from the Pi Network finding that 56% of Americans agree that racism remains a major problem in America these days, but a very sharp partisan split there with 36% of Republicans versus 76% of Democrats. And about a third of people worrying that schools are focusing too much on race and racism. 60% of Republicans versus 14% of Democrats. So clearly these are unsettled issues and there are sharp partisan splits that we're aware of. And we think that there's really urgent need for evidence about what Americans want schools to teach. So, we know, for instance, that parents are majority supportive of inclusion of sexual orientation to at least some degree in sexuality education, and that most Americans say that they oppose laws prohibiting classroom lessons about these topics. And surveys do suggest approval of some race-related topics in the curriculum and mixed views of others. But I think the overall point is that there's this growing partisan split on education policy, particularly around curriculum issues, that is really threatening our shared commitment to public education, right? Driving a wedge between parents and schools in a particularly dangerous way. And I would argue that education has often been a site for successful bipartisan or nonpartisan policy efforts. I mean, you could go back to the George W. Bush and the Barack Obama administrations, and their education policies were not really that different. No Child Left Behind passed with overwhelming bipartisan majorities in Congress. And we just don't have that kind of bipartisan agreement on education policy anymore. And I think specifically with regard to these civic issues, we can all agree that the civic nature of life in the United States is very frayed right now. And public schools have a very important role in promoting civic values in education. And certainly we can also all agree that racism and homophobia or transphobia remain widespread in American society and also in schools. And that there remains substantial discrimination against LGBT students and students of color in schools, which contributes to well-known disparities in mental health and student well-being. And that schools that have more inclusive curricula are places where students feel safer and have better academic and mental health outcomes. So I should say before I go any further that I welcome, by the way, questions as we go on, so feel free to raise your hand and interrupt if you have questions. We certainly don't have to wait till the end. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about the data for the study, and then I'm going to go through a lot of different findings, so it's hopefully there'll be things that will be provocative to you. So this is the context into which we stepped in, and the data for this study come from something called the Understanding America study, which is a nationally representative, probability-based panel of American households. And by probability-based, I mean they use address-based sampling, meaning they have a list of addresses in the United States, and they randomly select those addresses, and so it is the best form of representative sample that you can get. It's not a convenient sample like many of these polls these days, where there's a panel and it's an opt-in situation. It is a probability-based sample. It started as with a sample of about 7,000. These days it's actually up to about 13,000 respondents, and it dates back to 2014. And it's a panel study, meaning that we follow the same households over time. And so we've been following some of these households, the earliest ones, for over a decade now. The UAS is run out of a center at USC called the Center for Economic and Social Research, and the broader UAS is focused on economic things, right? It's focused on people's job participation, their labor, their wealth, their attitudes towards the economy, health measures, their health behaviors, things like that. And the data are publicly available for researcher use, and to respondents who might not be able to afford it are provided with tablets and Wi-Fi, and there's the website. And I should say the major funder for the broader UAS is NIH, and so we're certainly concerned about recent NIH cuts and the extent to which they will affect our ability to continue this work moving forward. So that's the UAS. And essentially what happened was COVID. And COVID happened, and we had the UAS that was sitting there. We had this sample of households. And I have a colleague who works over at CSER, whose name is Anna Saavedra. She's a research scientist there. And she came to me and she said, hey Morgan, COVID happened. We really want to use the panel to understand what's happening with regard to education in the United States as a result of COVID. And so that's how we got our first Gates grant and National Science Foundation grant, because we had the panel already there. So we sampled the households in the UAS sample that had K-12 students in the household, and we started surveying them about education-related issues. So that was how we got started, and we did over 30 waves of surveys during COVID to the approximately 1,700 households with K-12 children, and we covered a range of different topics, things like, and we covered whatever topic was relevant at the time, right? So, you know, in 2020-21, it was a lot of questions about attendance mode. Are you in person or online? Do you prefer to be in person or online? How do you feel about vaccines? Then in 21-22 was about COVID recovery interventions. Are you getting tutoring? Things like that. And so we've been surveying them about those COVID things. And then I thought, boy, there's some interesting politics happening in the United States right now. We should also survey them about what they think about education. And so we started surveying our sample of families with children about education policy, and we thought, well, we should also survey other people who don't have children, right, because we all vote, and so we should know what both parents and non-parents think. And so that's what we started to do, and we did this survey, again, funded by the Hewlett Foundation in 2022. We surveyed about 3,700 people about race and LGBT topics in the curriculum. At that time we were talking about critical race theory, now we've moved on to DEI, but at that time it was CRT. So we talked about that topic, and we talked about other policies at the time. We did another survey in 2023 where we dove deeper on mostly those same topics, and we also talked about what people value out of education, and we also talked about school choice and sort of economic questions. And then this survey that I'm going to present to you some more of today, which is focused on civics education and also free speech on college campuses and DEI on college campuses. So, you know, we're trying to figure out what are the things that are most relevant at the given time, and that's what we're asking about. Again, these data are publicly available, and I encourage you to go and access them if you're interested. I note the response rates here again, just to illustrate the quality of the data, right? So typical public opinion polls these days have response rates in the range of 2%. And we have response rates of 80% because we have a panel of households who are bought in, we pay them for their time, they're part of our sample, and so they are as good a quality data as you can get for this kind of work.
How are they compensated?
We pay them, to do the survey, you pay, it's $2.50 per respondent minute, so if it's a 10-minute survey, they don't get all of that money, but I think they get about $2 a minute or something like that, so it's like 20 bucks.
So could I ask you your thoughts on the ethics of that?
Of paying them?
Yeah.
Well, I think, it sounds like you have thoughts about the ethics of it. I haven't really thought about the ethics of it. I would be more concerned about, does paying them in some way bias the results, right? Do they become a non-representative sample in some way because we're paying them? And I am not the right person for that question, but I can assure you that we have people on the team who study that question. How representative the panel stays over time, you know, do they match the population on observables? And so there are people who use the sample to answer those kinds of questions. And I think they broadly find the sample is good. So that said, it's not perfect. One indication that it's good is that, like during COVID, when we had various data sources that were tracking vaccination rates, our data matched the CDC's data on vaccination rates, which were the gold standard, much better than other public opinion polls matched vaccination rate. So it's not, you know, there's other kinds of pieces of evidence that suggest that it's a good sample. So, and I'll get to the results for this study, but I just want to illustrate, these are the ranges of topics that we've talked about, that we've surveyed about and reported on over the course of the 4 years since, 5 years now, since the onset of COVID. And so we covered all the major issues. I'm only going to focus really on the bottom right here, which is controversial topics in the curriculum. But the other thing that we're still doing is we're still looking at COVID recovery in various ways. So for instance, we have a new grant that's focused on attendance, understanding which kids are absent, what are the barriers to attendance. We've started to do some mixed methods work where we also interview families, so we sample them based on their survey responses and then we interview them. You know, families with high attendance and low attendance and kids who have mental health concerns and don't have mental health concerns. So that's one thing that we're continuing to focus on. We're building a teen panel. So in the households where we survey the adults, we're going to start surveying the teens as well. And so that's going to be really great because we'll have linked responses within households. And then we're doing other kinds of things that funders want to fund. So a lot of people are interested in AI. So we're surveying about AI and how AI plays out in education. So those are the three main things that we have funding to continue to be working on right now. And the data have been reported very widely. This has been by far the most rewarding and impactful thing I've ever done in my career, and it's been really wonderful to be a part of. Because we had this sample and we're really able to pounce right at the beginning and have really been able to sort of influence the discussion over time. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the results that I'm going to be sharing with you, and I guess this is just to illustrate the three main reports that I'm drawing from. So our 2022 report asked about all these questions, and I'm going to only present data on the fourth bullet there, the one in bold, which is what LGBT and race-related topics do parents believe should be taught in schools. We also, by the way, asked them what LGBT and race-related topics are taught in schools, and for the most part, people don't know what's taught in schools, but they mostly don't think that the things that you hear about are actually being taught in schools, especially in elementary school, if they have an opinion on that. Then our 2023-24 report was asking about these questions, and here I'm going to go into more detail, and we really delved into specific scenarios with regard to race and LGBT related topics, and we wanted to understand what are people comfortable with and at what grade levels. And so we wrote a bunch of different scenarios that we thought sort of covered the gamut from sort of relatively benign to probably pretty provocative. And we asked people to say how supportive they were, and I'll show you some of those results. And then this report, that's the cover page, as I said, it's going to come out either this week or next week. We don't have a release date quite yet. Is about this range of topics. I'm only going to talk about the first bullet, which is the civics topics. If you are interested in the stuff on free speech and DEI on campuses, I could pull up the report and show you at the end of the presentation, but I don't have that included because it's higher ed related, not K-12 related. So, because of the richness of the UAS and the fact that we've been surveying these people over time, we can report lots of different demographic splits, and I'll present really only partisanship. We could look at all these other demographic splits, and in some papers, we actually go a little bit deeper and we break it down by these other things. I will say partisanship drives everything and is overwhelmingly where the splits are the largest. The next one that's closest to partisanship is religion, especially on the LGBT issues, but it's partisanship driving everything. Okay. Any questions before I get started?
When you asked, because the way the data analysis question was worded, did you couple LGBTQ topics with race-related topics when asking questions, or were they like addressed as separate issues?
They are addressed as separate issues. We did not ask any intersectional questions, which is a good question and a good point, I would say, and we didn't.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so here are the four takeaways, just to preview. First, we find widespread support and surprising bipartisan agreement about the importance of civics education and the specific topics and scenarios that are the most important. So that's the new finding, and we're hoping that that gets some attention because we see agreement, which is nice, and a lot of support for civics education. Second finding is that people want high schoolers to learn about controversial topics but are much more mixed for elementary schoolers. So there's clearly some concern about age appropriateness. And, you know, our data is kind of coarse, but we can highlight some areas where people are concerned. Third, there are enormous partisan differences, in particular on LGBT scenarios. And also with regard to the racial topics, the ones that are specifically focused on present-day racial inequality, or like you might say like the enduring legacy of racism, or the ways that racism still manifests, or how white people benefit from racism, topics like that, those seem to be the ones that are the biggest pressure points. And then the fourth one, which is a paper that we just submitted, we do find that we can explain, so we also ask people about reasons why they might support and oppose, and we can explain some of the partisan differences by some of the attitudes that we asked about, and I'll tell you what those attitudes are later on. So first finding, this is the new one. If no one's tweeting in here because Twitter's not a thing anymore, but if you were tweeting, I would say please don't tweet until I finish finding one. There's widespread support and surprising bipartisan agreement about the importance of civics education. So, first of all, that said, we asked people what civics education was, and they said they don't know. I think one thing that, one sort of universal truth about surveying about education policy is like, people don't really know what education policy is. So we asked them what civics education is, and like, what is the number there? Overall, 49% of people just said they know nothing about it, and another 45% said they know a little. So half people just readily admit to you they don't know what civics education is. Then we asked them, for those who said they knew something, what is it? And overwhelmingly they said government, but these were the other words that they said, so you can see it's about citizens, it's about rights, it's about our society and how it works, it's about our responsibilities and our history. Which, I mean, that's not a bad answer. That's in the ballpark. I'm not a civics educator, so maybe there's a civics ed person in here who can tell me that that's a bad answer, but to me it sounds not bad. Americans don't think that's, again, lots of people have opinions about things they don't know very much about, and so Americans give middling grades to schools on preparing students civically, even though they think it's an important thing to do. So we ask them to give letter grades A, B, C, D, F on how well schools prepare kids to be good workers, to be good citizens, to be successful in college, and to be prepared for adult life. And you can see that citizens is in the middle there, so the one that they think is best is prepare students for success in college. I don't know that I agree with that, but that's what people think that we're the best at. And the one that they say K-12 schools do the worst at is being prepared for adult life. We don't do a good job of preparing kids for that. But about a third of people give schools a D or an F on being good citizens, and about a third say an A or a B, right? So those are pretty even splits, but lots of people think that schools aren't doing that good a job. That said, when you ask them, is this important? Everyone says all these things are important, although college success is the one that is rated as being the least important among the four. Interestingly, we find that Republican support for civics education has actually ticked up a little bit since 2021, and we looked, by the way, and this isn't a compositional change because of who's identifying as Republicans, but on most of these items that we asked about a bunch of different topics. The bump was about 5 to 7%. So more Republicans are saying that civics education is important. Democrats didn't really change, but we're still higher than Republicans on most of these. We also, by the way, asked, in addition to just saying, is this important, which these are the results for the is this important question, we also asked, what are your top 3 from the list? The most important. For Republicans, they were how the government works, the U.S. leadership role in the world, and the importance of federalism. Or, I don't have the exact wording there, but the federal government's influence over state and local affairs, so that's what we call federalism. So that's what Republicans said. For Democrats, it was how the government works, racism in the United States, and income inequality in the United States. So you can see everyone agrees that how the government works is important, but we do start to see some disagreement in the most important beyond those topics. We also asked about a bunch of different civics activities, and I'm going to show a bunch of figures like this throughout the presentation. Basically, on these figures, the blue dot is Democrats, the red dot is Republicans, the gray dot is average, and the purple dot is neither. So that's either you're some third party or you don't identify as a Democrat or Republican. But so you can see, this is a nice way to illustrate the partisan gaps, and you can see on these different kinds of activities, civics-related activities, the gaps are actually quite small, right? None of these gaps are really that big except for one. Anyone see the one that's big?
Recite the first one.
Recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So Republicans feel very strongly that children should be reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, 84% versus 44% of Democrats who think that's important. But on everything else, these gaps on civics-related activities are not that small, or sorry, not that large. And that ranges from things like evaluating arguments on a topic, learning about registering to vote, debating a topic from the opposite point of view, even doing community service as part of classwork. I might think that there would be a big split there. So there's a lot of agreement, actually, that these are important things to do. So that's the framing that we're hoping gets attention. We're hoping some media outlet will pick this up, and we like that finding. As I said, this report also contains findings about free speech on campus and DEI on campus, which is, we definitely see much bigger splits on those topics.
The join a local protest during school time.
Is very unpopular.
Yeah, on both sides, yeah.
On both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I should have said that. So the other thing that I would say about this figure is, in addition to there being not a big split, most of these are pretty popular, right? So in fact, all but that one, all but join a protest are above 50% on average. And many of them are like 3/4 or higher supporting these things, yeah? So these are pretty popular things for people to do. That said, of course, when you do surveys like this, there's a sort of a tendency to acquiesce and agree that things are good. And so I think another way to ask this would be like, if you were to say which of these is most important, then you might get a slightly different answer. But yes, joining a protest during school time, very unpopular. Yeah, question, Meg?
How much do you preface the questions with like context of here's what we're looking for when we define civics activities? And do you notice when you coach it as civics-related activities versus like coaching it in the language of the current arguments, like using language like, oh, do you think critical race theory should be taught in schools? Do you think social emotional learning should be taught in schools? Do you think like using those buzzwords that they know and recognize?
So we spend a lot of time going back and forth on survey wording, of course, because it's very important. I don't know, so we don't generally do a lot of preambles, right? We don't want to give people, we don't want to sway people to think one way or the other. So that's in some way why we ask the question. We did not give a definition of civics education, I don't believe, on this survey. We asked them, do you know what it is? Do you have an opinion about it? And then how do you feel about these scenarios? Like, and I think for these questions, they're questions about support, oppose. That's the scale here. Would you support this? Would you support or oppose this happening in a classroom or something like that? I get the exact wording, but we really do not do a lot of preambles. If we're ever concerned about something like that, sometimes we'll do a split sample, and we will split the sample in half and randomly assign different ways of presenting. We didn't do that on this survey. I will say this survey we administered right around the election, and so we did a split sample on that. We randomly assigned half the people to get it right before the election and half the people to get it right after the election, and basically we found no differences, which was, so then we present the results for the full sample.
To what extent, when you look at like nationwide civic standards or social studies standards, are the things that people agree on represented or not represented? Because you mentioned like,
yeah,
people are going to see that there's not that much difference. So the question would be, well, what would they then align on registering students when they turn 18? I'd imagine that's a pretty common thing already happening.
Right. Yeah. Well, and again, this is where I show you that I don't know very much about this topic. So all I will say, so I don't really know what's in civic standards. I do study standards-based reforms, but civics is really not my area. My colleague Anna Saavedra is a civics person and has had grants from IES about civics education. She has one currently right now, and she's in big with the civics crowd. Like so the civics, the organization called iCivics is very enthusiastic about these results, as you might imagine. So they want to sort of trumpet them because which tells me that they must align with whatever is important in civics education. And also, I would say Anna helped write the survey, and so I trust that Anna knew that these were the topics that she should be asking about. But you are illustrating sort of my ignorance about civics education, and so I think that I should know more about that.
Could I ask a related question? So how were the items validated?
So the way that we're just people who write survey items for a living, and I teach a survey methods class, and so we do, I think, do a pretty good job of writing survey items, but the best that we can do is, if there is an existing scale, sometimes we'll use that. Not in this case, we don't have it, but like, for instance, we've surveyed about mental health, parents' reports of kids' mental health, and there, of course, we use a validated survey. For these, we do cognitive interviews before, with a few respondents, before we go out in the field, and if they raise questions about the response scale or about any particular items, then we'll take that into account and try and revise the item. So that's the best answer I can give you is, we know how to write surveys, and we also try them out in cognitive interviews, but I can't promise you, of course, that, as with anything, if you ask the question in a different way, that you might have gotten a slightly different response.
An observation, maybe you'll want to respond to it later, but this degree of unanimity or close proximity of viewpoints across party lines really points to a dynamic in which what differences there are taking people's almost their entire attention.
Yes. Yeah, I think that is right. And I think, and I would argue, right, that it is an intentional strategy to be to be focusing, all of our education policy attention on race and LGBT related topics where the partisan divides are the sharpest. And I think there already would have been partisan divides, but then they're being driven up even further. And whereas I think on actually many issues, not just this one, whether it's testing or even school choice, there's actually a fair amount of there's not nearly as much partisan division on many education policy topics among the populace. But on these topics, which are the ones that are being focused on right now, clearly that's correct. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in time to 2022, and I'm going to present results from a couple studies that are already out there, but also some other findings that aren't yet published, and talk about, okay, so civics, there's a lot of agreement, but what about these other issues? So broadly, our second finding is that people want high schoolers to learn about controversial topics, but they're much more mixed for elementary schoolers. So age appropriateness is an issue. So on our 2022 survey, we asked these relatively coarse topics about a range of different topics, ranging from things like trans rights and gender identity and sexual orientation and gay rights, which are the ones on the far left, those are the least supported, to Second Amendment. We often framed things in both sort of conservative terms and more liberal terms. So for instance, we asked about Second Amendment rights and we asked about gun control, right? Do you support this being taught in schools? And so what you can see, this is for high schoolers, is there's a majority that supports every single topic on this list being taught from both perspectives. The LGBT related ones are definitely the lowest, there's no question about that. But we saw support on all these topics at the high school level. I don't know why I use a different graph for elementary school, but it's a different graph. It's the same items, but this is for elementary school. And what you can see in elementary school is there's a lot less support. So, the bottom 2/3 are items that are underwater. Less than 50% of people support those topics. And those include things like even teaching about income inequality in elementary school. So only 44% of people think that you should be doing that. And if you look at the ones that are really, I would say like 2/3 or higher is really, okay, there's strong support for that. It's just the top 6. The environment, slavery, by the way, that is one. That is a controversial topic that people think elementary school kids can handle. Slavery, the environment, critical thinking, patriotism, and then at the very top, the contributions of women and people of color and the contributions of founding fathers. So people definitely think elementary schoolers can and should be learning about those things, which I think actually runs quite counter to, like, for instance, the Dear Colleague letter that we got on Friday, which suggests that any discussion of these topics is pretty much verboten. People think that elementary schoolers can handle those. Of course, one could say in age-appropriate ways, I'm sure, right? So that was our 2022 survey, and it was, I think it was important to learn this, but these were very coarse topics, right? So we just asked about, gay rights. Well, that could be a lot of different things. What does it mean to teach about gay rights? And we really wanted to drill down on these race and LGBT scenarios. So in our 2023 survey, we wrote a bunch of scenarios that we thought represented basically the kinds of ways in which this would come up. And so we asked 24 scenarios. Now, this is a case where we did a split sample. We randomly split, and so everyone only got 12 of these, and they were randomly allocated, and of course randomly ordered, and all the things that you're supposed to do. And so we see sort of similar broad patterns. So with regard to LGBT scenarios, we saw that there is majority support, but only for about half of the detailed LGBT items. And you can see the threshold is LGBT American history, the contributions of LGBT individuals to American history. That's only 50% of people believe that is appropriate for high schoolers. And everything below that is under 50%. And you can see, for instance, gender identity ones and trans-related ones tend to be towards the bottom in terms of overall support. And things related to sex, I would say, also tend to be towards the bottom. But even ones that surprise me, like the classroom has LGBTQ-friendly decorations, under 50% of people think that is appropriate at the high school level. So people think, I would say, I read that as, people think that's a political statement, and they don't think that that's appropriate in a classroom.
Can you leave it for just one?
Yeah, sure.
There's a lot of interest.
There's a lot of, I know, I always wonder about how to present these graphs, so. We had some interesting ones in here, like, this is one of my favorites. We had, so here we've got a reading with an opposite sex intimate scene. And then down here we have a reading with the same sex intimate scene. So that was, again, a split sample. So we randomly assigned, so it was the same exact wording, except some people got same sex intimate scene and some people got opposite sex intimate scene. And you can see there's a 18-point difference, 14-point difference there, which I would say is just homophobia. Right?
Right, because they're very close on opposite sex. They're very closely aligned, but not so when it's...
Mm-hmm.
So the intimacy is not the problem.
The intimacy is not the problem.
Yeah.
Although that's still not that, for high schoolers, right, that's still not that high, that's 54%. People have a lot of concerns about sex, I think is another finding that surprised me a little bit.
Oh, yeah, I was looking at the love story. I was looking at higher up.
And yeah, and then like way at the top, so there are a few that have like overwhelming support, and those are the non-gay ones, right? So, because we wanted to include a few as like comparisons, right? So when we wrote this, we were trying to, we had in mind that we were trying to basically write along the difficulty, right? Like there's an underlying difficulty index in this, and so we wanted to write really easy items that lots of people would agree to, which are turned out to be the ones at the top, like a lesson about standing for others, or a book with an opposite-sex love story. And then we wanted ones that we thought would be quite difficult, which, frankly, were the trans-related items that we thought a lot of people wouldn't agree with. And we saw, by and large, we did a pretty good job. Our original sorting, I think, approximately matched what people ended up writing. With the one that really stood out to me was the LGBT-friendly decorations, which I thought would be higher up than it is.
Where's that one? Oh,
So
yeah.
69% of Democrats think that's okay, but only 20% of Republicans do. I'm going to get to the partisan splits in a minute, but you can already see them.
So no rainbows.
No rainbows, no pride stickers, yeah.
I'm looking at the top line, and if I'm reading it right, Republicans and Democrats are almost exactly the same about why being kind to others matters. But independents are significantly lower down on that thing.
Yeah, they don't want to
I'm
be
just
kind
trying to figure
to
out,
others.
who are these independents?
Keep your eye on the independents, because some of their results also stand out. Like, for instance, on this one, so on the LGBT and the race one, it almost always goes Democrats most supportive, independents in the middle, Republicans at the bottom.
Yeah.
But on the civics one, it's actually the independents who are at the bottom. And I think some of these folks are just not so civically engaged, probably, and that's part of what drives them to identify as independents and not.
They're
That's
off
my
the
guess.
grid.
They're off the grid, yeah. Yeah.
Because partisan surveys oftentimes have hidden Republicans in the independent identifier. In a lot of political surveys, especially ones that are voting rights and engagement, people will say they are independent, but tend to have their partisan views more aligned with heavily Republicans rather than people who say they're just regular Republicans.
There could be some of that as well, and we could look into that too. Okay, so there's majority support for about half of the LGBT scenarios, but there is majority support for every single race-related scenario that we asked about at the high school level. So people are more comfortable with race-related topics than LGBT-related topics, I would say. And the least supported one here, which has 56% support, is a math project on, that analyzes data on office referrals by race. I don't remember the exact wording there, but basically to look for racial disproportionality in office referrals. That's 56% support. But you can see that most of these have about 2/3 or higher. And some of these are, you know, reading a book with a black man wrongly accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. People think that is a reference to a particular book. I don't know which book it is off the top of my head. Is that To Kill a Mockingbird? Thank you. I read that in 6th grade, so it's been a while. You know, discussing the ways that white people benefited from slavery. 67% of people agree that that is an appropriate topic for high schoolers. So, more support for the race-related topics in high school. Then we asked about, you know, for all people, we asked about the question separately for elementary and secondary. So they got both, and they could respond to both. And so we see there is very limited support for LGBT scenarios in elementary school. Not one of them is above 50%, except for the 3 that are really not about LGBT stuff at all. And many of them are like a quarter or lower, and even on many of them, Democrats are below 50%. So there's clearly an age appropriateness issue at play here with regard to LGBT issues in elementary school.
I'm having a hard time seeing it. Is the one directly under the red line a teacher's same-sex spouse?
Yeah, so that is,
on their desk?
yeah, so we asked them, is it appropriate for the teacher to have a picture of their same-sex spouse on their desk? And for this one, only 49% of people say that's appropriate for elementary school teachers.
Wow.
You know, the book about same-sex penguin adoption, right? And Tango Makes Three, that's the second one right below that. Discussing different family structures, including that you might have 2 moms or 2 dads, right? That's right below that. But yeah, the depth of opposition, and in particular, the strength of Republican opposition here. I mean, Republicans are like unanimously opposed on virtually all of these, right? Like many of them are 10% or less. So this is something where Republicans feel very strongly.
Would you say like this age appropriateness like issue kind of goes hand in hand with like the ability of influence that's on the child? Because I feel like elementary students are much more influenced or easily influenced than high schoolers.
So we actually, in this survey, it's not in these slides, but we also asked people, oh no, it is in these slides, you'll get to it later, but we also asked people reasons why you might support or oppose, and one of them was like, reading about reading about gay rights might make my child wonder if they are gay or something like that, and we saw a lot of people, it's like 60% of people said yes.
Yeah, because I see like the Democrats also dropped a lot,
Yeah.
and I think that the influence factor might be heavy for them.
And oh, this should say elementary school, that's a typo. I was like, that's the next one. So this should say elementary school, but similarly with regard to the race-related topics, most people think most of these topics are not appropriate for elementary schools, although there are some that have majority support, so things like acting out civil rights demonstrations, a lesson on the ways the colonists harmed Native Americans, teacher acknowledging native lands, that surprised me, I thought that that would be lower. The overwhelming thing that everyone loves is colorblindness, which is the top item, equal treatment regardless of skin color. 90% of people think that that's appropriate.
Is that across the board?
Yeah, I mean, you can see, so it's 93, it's actually, Democrats are more supportive of that, 93% of Democrats, 89% of Republicans. This idea of equal treatment regardless of skin color is at the very top. And by the way, you can see that language in the Dear Colleague letter, if you go read the Dear Colleague letter from Friday, that is the framing that they use, and there's a reason why they use that framing. So, third finding, partisan gaps, which I already showed you, right? You already saw the partisan gaps, but I'll highlight a few things in both of these sets of results. So, first of all, Republicans strongly oppose everything having to do with LGBTQ scenarios in elementary school. You can see that not one of those. The teacher same-sex spouse on their desk is the most supported, which only a third of Republicans are okay with, but everything else is a quarter or less. Interestingly, the gaps are even large. Let me just finish my statement then. Interestingly, the magnitude of the gap, just Democrat minus Republican, is actually even larger for high school than it is for elementary school. Because basically, Democrats are fine with these things in high school, and Republicans, a lot still aren't. Many of these topics, the gaps are 40 or 50 percentage points at the high school level.
I was just gonna ask if there is any evidence of elementary school kids being as susceptible to these topics as the respondents are making it seem.
Oh, that is a great question. I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think that people, right, you hear about things on Facebook about, whatever, litter boxes in classrooms, right? So like,
What?
That's a real thing.
that's a real thing. That is a real thing that people put on Facebook, and I think some people believe has actually happened. I believe senators have actually mentioned that, and I want to say maybe one of your senators. I don't want to get in trouble here. But no, I mean it's a real issue. Like, is it a real thing that children are susceptible? That I can't answer. But do people think that is a real thing? That I can say, yeah, lots of people think that's a real thing, right? So, kids identify, there's no question that more kids now identify in different ways than they used to. Now, is that because they're more comfortable, identifying how they feel? Or is it because they're being indoctrinated by woke teachers? That's a difference of a difference of perspective about what might be the underlying causes of that. I can't really answer the question of what are the underlying causes of that, even though I probably have some opinions about that as a gay man. But it's definitely an issue and part of the framing. Were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say, and there are 5 people in this room who heard it from me in our social studies methods course. One of the things that I am most desperate for is some sort of psychological guidance on what is appropriate to teach kids at what age.
Yeah.
And not even about LGBTQ issues,
Right.
but like if we want to teach the truth about history, well, how much truth is going to scar a first grader
Right.
versus what an 11th grader can handle? There is nothing, as far as I can tell, like there are not psychologists who publish books for teachers that say, this is how you talk about slavery to first graders, this is how you can talk about it when you're in 3rd or 5th. So I think a lot of times teachers are just sort of flying blind, and sometimes
Yeah.
they get it wrong.
Yeah.
And sometimes kids are upset in ways because they heard things that were not developmentally appropriate, because there isn't, that I'm aware of, any guidance for teachers from psychologists, developmental psychologists who could say,
Yeah.
this is appropriate or this is something kids can handle. I mean, it's a silly example, but Louisiana completely reordered its social studies standards in the last couple of years, so now topics that were taught in 6th grade are being taught in 4th grade, topics that were being taught in 10th grade are being taught, everything is mixed up. And so one of the things they're teaching in 5th grade now is they're teaching the period in world history that includes the Black Death, right? And teachers don't know how to do that, and so I have heard from different families of 5th graders that their kid was absolutely traumatized because the 5th grade teacher thought, I'll show them photographs of what the lesions look like,
Yeah.
right? And other teachers were like, we'll just talk about it being an illness, right? But there's no guidance for
Yeah.
teachers on what's going to give a 10-year-old nightmares.
Well, and I think, right, and so I would say so I totally agree with everything you just said, and then I would just say, just to generalize it, like, we need more of, like, practical, like, okay, this is what this means, this is what, in California we think is an age-appropriate curriculum, and that's going to be different in Louisiana, and that's how America works, but like, I do believe that you could bring people together and come up with, this is a serious age-appropriate curriculum, like, get down to brass tacks, what are people concerned about? It also, you also don't have to necessarily just kowtow to what people's opinion is, because people's opinions could be wrong or bad, but you can't broadly, you can't force people too much to do things they don't want, because then you are likely to see some backlash. Yeah.
I have a question for the lady that just stated. When you asked that question towards those families, like, what was the demographic of the family that you asked that towards?
About,
Like, the appropriateness and the inappropriateness of, like, leisures at, like, a certain age or, like, a certain education?
oh, I'm just speaking anecdotally. Like, I wasn't doing a survey or anything like that. Like, I have a fifth grader, and her friends go to different schools, and some of her friends were traumatized by the way their teachers presented it, and some of them were not. So I don't have, like, formal survey data or anything.
In terms of our question about racial inequality, the gaps are the largest on items that I would say sort of relate to present day racial inequality. So for instance, the ways that criminal justice negatively affects Black or Hispanic Americans, there's where we see a 51 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans, and an assignment on how US policies have harmed Black and Hispanic Americans, similarly a 47% gap. Slightly smaller gaps on some other topics, but those are some of the ones that are the largest. Okay, and then the last thing, which is another finding that no one has seen quite yet, but it's in a paper that's under review, is we tried to understand, okay, well, what are the things that are driving those partisan gaps? They exist. Republicans and Democrats feel very differently about race and LGBT topics, so can we figure out what they are? And so, in addition to asking, do you support or oppose these things, we also asked reasons why you might support or oppose them. So for instance, we asked, do you agree that children should read books written by people from racial minority groups because those books provide different experiences and perspectives? Which 3/4 of Americans agree with that statement, and even 2/3 of Republicans agree with that statement. And you can see there's agreement on some of these items, but the two items where there's real disagreement are children should learn about the ways white people have been racist historically, even if that makes them feel guilty. So Democrats are 81% in agreement, whereas Republicans are only 33% in agreement. And children learning about minority individuals or groups in school takes away time they should spend learning about more important things, which 47% of Republicans agree with versus just 12% of Democrats. So we wanted to know from these 5 items, and there was one other item we asked about, do any of these explain the partisan gaps? And so basically we just do some statistics and we try and tease that out. And so how do we do this? Well, we created an overall index score measuring their support or opposition to race-related content in the curriculum. We used item response theory for this, which is just a way to aggregate survey items. And then we do a regression, so we statistically analyze the relationship of this index score with the partisan indicator, the Republican and Democrat indicator, and a bunch of demographic variables. And then we add in these hypothesized reasons, and we see which ones do the best job of explaining the partisan gap. And I'm actually going to skip these because this is too, skip that one because it's a little bit technical. Just to say that there are demographic splits on all these things, and they're quite large. And then the reasons that we asked about do relate to their overall support. So each individual reason was related to their overall support for race-related topics and in the directions that you would think. So if you agree that children should learn about the ways white people have been racist historically, even if that makes them feel guilty, then you believe that we should teach more race-related stuff by about 1/3 of a standard deviation. That's what that coefficient is. And so then, now what we do is we try and explain the raw partisan gap, which is the blue bar on the left, with each of these reasons. And so what we're looking at here is which bar gets closest to 0, right? So we add in a reason one at a time, and we say, can we get this partisan gap between Republicans and Democrats closest to 0? And the 2 items that stand out for explaining the partisan gap are the light green bar, which is that item about white students feeling guilty, and the purple bar, which is about the importance of different experiences and perspectives. And so basically how I read these results is that a lot of Republican concern about race-related topics in the curriculum is really driven by concerns about white students feeling guilty. And a lot of Democrat support for these topics is really about Democrats believing in the importance of different perspectives and experiences in the curriculum. And those two things together explain more than half of the partisan gap in these, so that goes back to your question a little bit.
Do you think that Americans' opinions on when and what topics should be taught has anything to do with people's opinion that the newer generation is sensitive?
It's a good question, and I mean, we've never asked a question like that. We do have more detailed political views in our surveys, and we could ask other political items and try and relate them to these results. I think that it's possible, that's a reasonable hypothesis about another factor that explains people's views on these topics, but we haven't asked it. So this is the finding that is relatively new, which is trying to explain these partisan gaps. And you can see the phenomenon operates the same at elementary and high. Like the patterns of bars look the same.
Sorry, can I just ask why you didn't opt for open-ended questions?
So we do have some open-ended questions. We do occasionally ask some open-ended questions on the survey. In this survey, the only open-ended question that we asked about was, what do you think civics education is? In these curriculum-related ones, it would be good to ask people, why do you support or oppose, right? And we haven't done that directly. Usually we have occasionally asked other open-ended questions, and you can do that. I mean, of course, the challenge is if you ask an open-ended question, then you have to analyze it, and we have a sample of 1,700, and it starts, can get a little tricky. We've typically done it in the context of when we didn't think that we really understood a phenomenon. So for instance, we asked it about school hesitancy. So back during COVID, when people were concerned about sending their kids to school, why were they concerned? What were their top reasons? And that was one where we didn't think that we really knew what was driving it, and so we wanted to understand, and we asked people. And we actually did learn something, and we wrote that up. And so, I actually think we could ask people more open-ended questions, but we haven't in this survey. And I think it's not a bad suggestion. Another thing we can do is we can interview people, and so we can sample people based on their responses and then go interview them. And we have done that, although again, we have not done that on this topic. Okay, so the summary of results, I don't need to say this stuff again, but I think, to me, what stands out is there is strong support for civics education and pretty strong bipartisan support. I think that, of course, there is some squishiness about what that means, and different people support different things, but I do think there is a common sense and common support for that topic. LGBT topics are very unpopular, especially in elementary schools. That is just a fact. And I might think, again, as a gay man who wished that my identity was affirmed in K-12, that I might wish that wasn't so, but that's the reality of how people feel about the situation. And so if you want to be more inclusive of LGBT issues, you're probably going to run up against concerns, especially around age appropriateness, right? And like and some of that is probably going to be based on what they heard on Facebook about kids using litter boxes. And some of that, is going to be based on, I think, what we might say are parents' genuine concerns about what is the appropriate domain for schools versus what is the appropriate domain for them as parents. Race-related topics are more widely supported, especially in high school, and I think that there probably are ways to include racial topics in ways that are more broadly palatable, and I think driving those topics out of the curriculum is not particularly popular, and so I think there is the possibility of backlash there. But then I would say, to get to the question about why didn't we ask open-ended, there's a lot more to know here, right? And this is what we could ask on a survey and what we chose to ask about. And of course, there's many different things that we could also have asked about.
Could you expand on what more broadly palatable means for racial-related topics?
So I think that there are probably ways to, I would say there are probably ways to frame the inclusion of race-related topics in the curriculum in ways that people can support. So like this thing about diverse perspectives, right? At the top there, right? Like 2/3 of people think that that's a good thing to do. And so if you say, we're including diverse, and we've also surveyed, I could go way back, but including diverse authors, that's also very popular, right? So those are the things that I think there are ways to frame it in that way that are broadly supportive, and then there are ways to frame it that Republicans in particular are going to be concerned about, and things that they view as sort of maybe racially divisive. Those are things that are likely to sort of lead to a lot of discomfort. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do them. Like, we might want to do them, but also, these are democratic institutions, and you know, if a school board doesn't want to do something, they're not going to do it, and it can lead to backlash. And so I do think that it's useful to be strategic about what it is that people want, and to, you know, include things which we all view as valuable, right? I totally agree that it's important to learn about diverse perspectives in the curriculum, and I think it's especially beneficial for students of color. I think the research is super clear on that. But you want to do it in a way that people can be on board with, right? And because these are democratic institutions.
Do you think, however, though, by associating or by making race-related topics palatable, so I'm going to be very blunt.
Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of being synonymous to adhering to white individuals and to make white comfort. If we're doing that, isn't that upholding the same institution that we're trying to break down, which is white supremacy? And so if we continue to push back by demanding this integrative and inclusive subject matter, then can we do that at the same time with being palatable?
Well, I totally get what you're hearing and what you're saying, and I think that, you know, there is what we all might think would be best, and there is what you can accomplish with the systems that we have. And so I do think that some measure of practicality or strategic thinking is a good idea. And even though, clearly the curriculum that I was taught was not critical enough about American history, and I did not learn those things until I got to my PhD program. We also have to deal with the reality of America.
Yeah,
And I think the question is good, and we should be asking that question.
Yeah.
Where is the line? I think that's going to differ in different places, and also different people are going to feel differently about that. But I think it's like we need to have those kind of concrete discussions that will be more productive.
And I do think, as I teach people who are going to be elementary school teachers here, and I teach people who are elementary school teachers here, and they're very concerned about losing their jobs. And so if we can say, because you could have the same assignment that does both of those things, right? Like, you could pick a book that represents a diverse perspective, but also criticizes white supremacy. But if you're an elementary school teacher who'd like to keep your job in Louisiana, maybe the part you tell parents about is the fact that we're exposing kids to a diverse perspective, right? Like, the lesson could still do both. It's the packaging that allows, because it would be irresponsible of me as a teacher educator to say, just go ahead and do things that are politically unpopular and you'll be okay, because they won't in a lot of cases. And then you can't do anything. You can't fight against the system if you have been fired from it.
Oh, I'm going to push back on that just for a second, because for Black educators and for Black students, there has been no privilege of kind of hovering over the line to protect our jobs. We haven't had that same kind of benefit. And so I do think for your Black students and your students of color in the classroom, you owe them a sense of allegiance to make sure that you're teaching their subject matter. Because no matter how you look at it, there are students who have continued to suffer from our negligence across the board regarding American education. There are students who have suffered in our classroom because we whitewash history and we whitewash facts in order to protect the American status quo. So I'm going to push back on that a little bit while also saying I respect your opinion. But to me, that shouldn't be the standard that we need. If we're trying to change the American educational system, we do have to uphold a certain standard. And to me, that's not reaching the bar.
So I'm going to jump in and just say that I think that I believe that this is a room full of people who probably all feel the same about this topic, and yet there is a sharp difference of opinion about some of these issues. And so I think that illustrates, if you go out into the other places, I think you're going to see even sharper differences of opinion, and I am, for better or for worse, a pragmatist who really cares about the future of American education and deeply worries about the extent to which these kinds of issues are driving, massive partisan disagreements that are undoing our public education system. And so I do think that, there is not a right answer here, but I think that we have to live in the reality of like our current political moment, and I do think that we have to be sensitive to the concerns of people across the political spectrum. And the other thing that I would say is that the views on these topics are not as unanimous by race and ethnicity as you might think either. And even, there are conservative people of color who voted for Donald Trump. In fact, more people of color voted for Donald Trump in this election than in previous elections and are supportive of this agenda. And so, I don't think we don't want to essentialize in kind of any direction about these issues. But I will say, I worry about this all the time, because if we think that it's important for students to be exposed to a more accurate telling of history, or the fact that their identities are valued, their racial identities and their gender or sexual orientation identities are valued, there's a lot of work to do to change people's opinions on those topics, because there's a lot of concern. And I think that looking across these scenarios is a useful exercise for thinking about what I hope is the next step, which is more practical conversations about what is an age-appropriate curriculum that can push on, the history of white supremacy in American society in ways that can get enacted and supported. And that's going to look different in different kinds of schools and different kinds of districts and states. But those kinds of concrete on-the-ground discussions are really needed, and so that's the sort of context that we hope that our results are useful for. So I'm happy to take any more questions. I really appreciate your engagement. It was really great. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Can you share with us the fate of the data and the findings with regards to integration the American education system in the light of the recent executive orders that are impacting the LGBTQ community? So what is the fate of the data and the findings in the American education system in regards to integration in the light of the recent executive orders impacting the LGBT community?
Well, I mean, so I think I understood your question, and I might need you to restate it if not. But people. Again, as I think I said earlier, right? Clearly, there's a lot of concern or squishiness in people's support for LGBT issues in the curriculum. That's especially true at the elementary grades, and I think that is being capitalized on and as part of a political agenda that's focused on, I would say, driving opposition to public education, right? And so that seems to be a pretty obvious political strategy that's happening right now, and it's working because it's working in part because people are concerned, right? I think, in particular, I would say the issue of, you could pick the most extreme and obvious example, which is the trans athlete thing, right? Which is clearly a thing that the president wants to talk about. When there are, 10 NCAA trans athletes in the whole NCAA, but it's a reason why they're talking about it, and the reason why they're talking about it is, if I could go back to here, it's at the very bottom. That is a thing that people are concerned about, and Democrats are concerned about it too. And so I also will say, the other thing that I care about is winning elections, and I don't think that it's a really great political strategy to hitch your election to that issue, which is an 80-20 opposed issue. And so, at the same time, and you can tell I'm torn up, I feel conflicted about this too. At the same time, I want to affirm people's trans identities, and I recognize that sometimes it's appropriate to be playing against, you know, opponents who match your gender identity, and sometimes it's probably not. And again, I think we need a little bit more of a real conversation about when's it appropriate and when's it not, rather than banning it or saying it's always okay, which is probably neither of those is actually right. And so, you know, again, I would say what we're seeing in terms of capitalizing on this issue is in part because I think it's a winning political issue, and it absolutely is a winning political issue. You will not find many more issues where there is that much opposition, and I feel badly for trans athletes who want to just play a sport, but it is not a thing that people are comfortable with or understand, and you know, so that is a real difficult situation.
So, in that case, would that affect the data integration in the education system? Because if there are executive orders that are, kind of like trying to affect that aspect of the data, what is the fate of its integration in the system?
I'm not sure that I understand the can anyone help me translate the question? I'm not sure what you mean by data integration.
Like the data is going to be utilized
Uh-huh.
by the education system, possibly for integration into the curriculum. So if there are executive orders that are, kind of like prohibiting the integration, would that affect the impact?
I think we should talk after one-to-one because I don't think that I'm understanding the question. But
yeah, so basically, if I understand what he's saying, he's trying to say that we are basically doing research because we want to make changes in the system. So if you are making a research and right now there are counter-executive orders countering the research that they're doing, then what is the impact that this research is going to make?
I see. Well, I mean, if, you know, I can't counter an executive order. I think that, I think that, you know, what I would say is it would be interesting to track these trends over time, and I think that that's a good question. How are these things being affected over time? I mean, the executive order does what it does, and, you know, how that gets enforced and how schools respond to it even if it's not being enforced. That, I think, is a great question, but yes, in some sense it doesn't matter because we passed a policy, well, it's not a policy, we have written a letter, and so now we have an executive order that is prohibiting this, so like why do we even ask about it or why do we care about it? But I still think that it's important to know about for a variety of different reasons, some of which we've already talked about.
The people who make policy in the United States don't look at they make their own policy based on their own views. So they're not always informed by the data from academics.
Now I know that Republicans score much higher in terms of religiosity. I believe 80% of Republicans identify as Christian, whereas about 60% of Democrats do.
Yeah.
I believe atheists are about 3 times more likely to vote for Democrats than they are Republicans.
Yeah.
Would you say that factors into opposition to LGBTQ?
Yes, definitely, and in
fact... Is that something you measured in this poll?
It is, and so in fact, I lied, well, so partisanship is still overwhelmingly the main driving factor here. Religion, just because, I mean, we see that statistically in the regressions, but the actual largest gaps on these items, especially on the LGBT items, are on religion. So atheists are the most supportive, and then Jews, and then at the bottom are evangelicals, right? And so, and those gaps are even larger than the partisan gaps, but if you like put them in a statistical model, it's the partisanship that wins out. But clearly these things are related, right? These are correlated factors that are explaining opposition.
Do you have time to give us a quick peek at the DEI and academic freedom?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, it'll just take me a second to pull it up if you want. Let's see. I already moved it to my publications folder.
These are fascinating.
Yeah, very good.
Excellent.
I mean, listen, it's like, it's my favorite thing that I do. It's also very demoralizing. But that's true of a lot of stuff in education, right?
But it also rings true. And so that's the kind of thing, when you see it, there's a few surprises, but overall, it just, you have to read.
And it sheds some light on on an issue that I think has a lot of heat, but not much light. Okay. All right, so free speech. What do you think? Do people like students having free speech on college campuses? They do not. So we asked about how appropriate is it for these various actions, and we asked about student actions, and then we asked about university actions. So the one thing to note about this figure is they're sorted by support, and it also happens that all of the university actions are more supported than all of the student actions. So, really disruptive forms of student protest are not supported by anyone. Things like students disrupting graduation, putting protest messages on university property, shouting down speakers that you disagree with. 2/3 to 3/4 of people think those things are never appropriate. And only like 4% think they're always appropriate. Not a lot of people would say that. But even things like skipping class and protest, only 34% of people say that's sometimes appropriate, and 8% say it's always appropriate. So student protest, protest camps, also quite unpopular. Even things like just criticizing university leaders on social media, not very popular. Whereas you go to the top and you say like, oh, police arresting students who break laws. 53% say that's always appropriate, right? And you might expect that, because we put the word breaking laws in the item, but the universities shutting down protests if they interfere with learning, which just seems like a kind of a low bar. 41% of people say that's always appropriate. So there is some mix in here, but overall, university actions to crack down on student protests are way more popular than student protest rights are. And then if you look at it by partisanship here, it's even stronger for Republicans. So Republicans are even more in favor of tamping down on student free speech rights, which I think is interesting. Maybe not how you would expect it to be. And then in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we asked about 4 items here, and they were requiring DEI training, hiring staff in charge of DEI, requiring DEI coursework, and requiring a statement of commitment to DEI. I can't remember the exact words. Requiring job applicants to write about their commitment to DEI. And you can see there's more, I would say these findings are actually more mixed than I expected them to be. The least popular of those is requiring a statement of commitment, but on most of these, first of all, 20% of people have no opinion or don't know. I think it's actually a thing that hasn't really penetrated, like, oh, that said, we surveyed about this in November, and it's all the president's talked about since he was inaugurated, and so it might be that people have stronger opinions now about it. But there was, again, not I would say like any unanimous support in either direction on these items. People say that DEI-related training is mostly appropriate. 64% either say sometimes or always, but that's not like overwhelming support. And then you do see big partisan gaps already when we surveyed about this in November between Democrats and Republicans on DEI. So, requiring DEI training, what is that? 82% of Democrats say that's either sometimes or always appropriate versus 51% of Republicans, which is actually probably higher than you might guess. So overall, I would say DEI, not that popular, but not that unpopular either. There's kind of mixed opinions about it to the extent that people know what even it is. And I think that this is one of those cases where we were asked how we write questions. We struggled with how to write about this one because even when we did cognitive interviews, people don't know what DEI is, right? So we did use those words. We did say diversity, equity, and inclusion in the items. And I think we did that because that's the framing that people are using right now, and so we wanted it to be sort of true to that framing.
This is just a strictly opinion question for you, and I know you don't have data on this, but which way do you think the relationship goes between those hot button items and the fact that they are politically popular and highly polarized? Like, do you think that there is high-level, high-quality polling that is happening out of the White House and that's how those issues are chosen? Or do you think it's the other way around? That because that's an issue that's been chosen, it's influenced public opinion? Like the trans athlete thing.
The trans athlete thing, that is a thing that I very firmly believe some consultant has told them is a winning issue.
So someone else has polled on that.
Yes,
and said,
that is,
"This the
I
thing
feel
that
very
will
strongly
win the
about,
election."
because I mean, how would you have an opinion about, like,
Right, okay.
who, it's so niche, it affects virtually no one.
Right.
You know, I mean, I think the media only talks about it because the president's talking about it, right? Like, it's just not really broadly an issue. Other ones, you know, it's hard to say, right? I do think that there's all, you know, the LGBT stuff and Republicans, like, they never really got on board, right? Like, they lost that at the Supreme Court, and then, you know, we all thought it was over, but it wasn't really ever over, and there was still a lot of concern about LGBT issues. And then I would say the trans stuff is even more fraught for a lot of Republicans than the gay stuff, and you can see that, by the way, in their actions, right? So, like, on the State Department website, they're taking the T out of things, right? They took the T out of the Stonewall Monument, right? And that tells you what they think the winning political message is here. They think that they can weaponize trans identities, and that they think that Democrats will rush to defend trans identities when most of those trans issues are really underwater because people don't understand trans identities and have a lot of concern about transgender people.
I was just about to say, your chart showed that Democrats overwhelmingly don't support the rights of trans people.
Yeah.
So, like, it's a winning issue for Republicans.
Yes.
And
we get in these bubbles, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone. We get in these bubbles and we think, oh, people should be more on board with this, but people are really not on board with it, and that is an issue.
The most disturbing statistic you put up there was somewhere around 50% of people are opposed to people going to their gender identity restroom.
Oh yeah, the bathrooms.
What do they think is going to happen when they go into
I mean, that's the
other
one.
restroom?
That's the other one, right? It's like it's another one where they, you know, people have not thought this through clearly, right? Like, so you've got the trans congresswoman from Delaware, and her Republican colleagues passed some rule that she has to use the men's room. And I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Like, you have a woman walking into the men's room. It doesn't make any sense to anyone. But that said, people don't understand it. And, you know, and what they hear is, because again, on Facebook or whatever, right, they hear like, oh, a man wearing a wig walks into the women's room, and that's what, right, because people don't understand trans identities. And it's just not a good situation. I have to say, I agree with you that that in particular is like a really rough finding, because they just want to use the bathroom. Yeah, last one, and then I think we're done.
So I grew up playing sports my whole life, and I've worked in sports at the college level, and I mean, I can assure you that it's a real issue.
Yeah.
It's a real issue that a lot of people have to face.
Yeah.
It's not just like some niche.
No, I mean, I don't mean to trivialize it. I affirmatively believe it is a real issue. I think the scale of it, right, that it's like a thing that would be so important that you would deal with it in your first 20 days in office or whatever. It doesn't quite match the sort of, as I said, the prevalence of trans athletes in the NCAA, which is not very many. But it is a real issue, and there are a lot of people who feel very strongly about it. And I think, you know, sometimes they have sometimes they have a reasonable, reason for feeling strongly about it. So no, I agree with you.
And in terms of the bathroom thing, I think gender-neutral bathrooms is a very good solution to the issue.
Except they're going after gender. I agree with you, but also they're going after gender-neutral bathrooms. So, but I agree with you that makes sense, and I think virtually anyone can be on board with gender-neutral bathrooms.
So Dr. Polikoff, I'd love to continue the conversation. The room is booked.
Yeah. Okay.
Someone else, and they're telling me.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Great survey.